April 23, 1945. The village of Rothenberg lay in ruins, its cobblestone streets cratered by artillery fire and its half-timbered houses reduced to skeletal frames against a smoke-darkened sky. In the basement of what had once been the town's bakery, 6 German boys huddled together in their oversized uniforms, waiting for what they believed would be their final moments. They had been told exactly what would happen to them if they were captured by the Americans. 15-year-old Erwin Mühlberg sat with his back against the cold stone wall, his Mauser rifle long since taken from him by the advancing American soldiers. His hands, still smooth despite months of military service, trembled slightly as he tried to maintain the stoic expression he thought a soldier should wear. Beside him, 14-year-old Horst Zimmer clutched a small sketchbook he had somehow managed to keep hidden throughout their capture. The pages were filled with drawings of home, of his mother's garden, of a Germany that no longer existed. 13-year-old Bernhard Vogt, who everyone called Bernie, sat furthest from the others, his jaw set in defiance even now. He had been the last to surrender, throwing down his weapon only when Sergeant Milton Kowalczyk had physically wrestled it from his grip. Bernie's eyes held a fierce hatred that seemed too large for his thin face, fed by years of propaganda about the brutality of American soldiers. He expected torture. He expected execution. He had been taught that Americans showed no mercy to German fighters, especially not to those who had defended the fatherland until the bitter end. 12-year-old Rudiger Hartmann, called Rudy by his friends, was crying quietly in the corner. He was the youngest of them, barely old enough to shave, though there was nothing to shave anyway. His Hitler Youth uniform hung loose on his small frame, the belt cinched tight to keep his pants from falling down. He had joined the Defense Forces only 3 weeks earlier when his older brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. Now he sat wondering if his mother would ever know what happened to him. Lothar Engel, 14, observed everything with careful attention despite his fear. He had always been the quiet one, the boy who listened more than he spoke. Even now, he was taking mental notes of the American voices outside their prison, trying to understand their words, searching for clues about what fate awaited them. Beside him, 13-year-old Waldemar Pfeiffer, who went by Waldy, whispered prayers under his breath. His father had been a pastor before the war, before the party had closed their church. Waldy prayed now for courage to face whatever came next. Above them, heavy boots moved across the floor. American voices spoke in tones the boys couldn't understand. They had been taught that these were monsters, that Americans delighted in cruelty, that capture meant unspeakable horrors. As the footsteps approached the basement stairs, Erwin reached out and took Horst's hand. Then Horst took Bernie's, and Bernie took Rudy's, until all 6 boys were linked together. If they were going to die, they would die as brothers. 6 months earlier, in October of 1944, these same boys had been living ordinary lives in their small Bavarian village. Erwin had been apprenticing at his father's carpentry shop, learning to plane wood and join corners with the precision his family was known for. Horst spent his afternoons sketching the changing autumn leaves, dreaming of attending art school in Munich someday. Bernie worked alongside his uncle in the village smithy, his arms growing strong from pumping the bellows and shaping iron. Rudy attended school religiously, hoping to follow his father into teaching. Lothar helped his mother manage their small farm after his father had been conscripted 2 years earlier. Waldy served as an altar boy at the village church, his clear voice leading hymns each Sunday morning. But the war had been closing in on Germany like a tightening noose. The Eastern Front had collapsed, Allied armies pressed from the west, and the Reich, desperate for defenders, had turned to its children. The call came through official Hitler Youth channels, presented not as conscription, but as sacred duty. Boys as young as 12 were told they were needed to defend the fatherland in its darkest hour. Propaganda posters showed young German warriors standing firm against the enemy tide, their faces shining with noble purpose. Erwin's father had tried to hide him, but the local party official had discovered the deception. The choice was presented clearly. Erwin would serve, or his father would be arrested for sabotaging the war effort. Horst's mother had wept for 3 days when her only surviving son received his orders. Bernie had actually volunteered, his hatred of the Allies burning fierce after his home was destroyed in a bombing raid. Rudy had no choice after his brother's death. The family needed someone to serve, to maintain their standing in the community. Lothar went because everyone else was going, because refusing seemed impossible. Waldy's father had blessed him before he left, whispering that God would protect the innocent even in war. The training had been brief and brutal. 10 days of learning to fire rifles, throw grenades, and dig defensive positions. Their instructors were veterans from the Eastern Front, hard men with empty eyes who had seen too much death. They taught the boys to shoot, but they also taught them to fear capture more than death itself. Stories were told of American savagery, of prisoners tortured and executed, of unspeakable acts committed against German soldiers. These stories were lies, propaganda, designed to ensure that child soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender. But the boys believed them because they had no reason not to. By the time they were deployed to defensive positions around Rothenberg in early April, they had transformed from village boys into something harder, colder. They wore uniforms that didn't fit properly and carried weapons too heavy for their young frames. They had been given the responsibilities of soldiers without any real understanding of what that meant. They were children playing at war until suddenly the war became terrifyingly real. The Americans arrived on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, a bitter irony that none of the boys appreciated at the time. The artillery barrage began at dawn, shells screaming overhead and exploding in the village with earth-shaking force. Erwin and his unit huddled in their hastily dug foxholes on the eastern edge of Rothenberg, trying to make themselves as small as possible as the world erupted around them. The sound was beyond anything they had imagined during training, a physical force that pressed against their chests and made their ears ring with constant high-pitched whining. Their commanding officer was a 48-year-old reserve lieutenant named Kessler, who had lost an arm on the Eastern Front. He moved among the positions, shouting encouragement that no one could hear over the bombardment. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence felt almost worse. They knew what came next. Through the smoke and dust, they could see movement. American infantry advancing in organized lines, using proper cover and tactical formations that made the boys' defensive preparations look childish by comparison. Bernie fired first, his shot wild and high. Then they were all shooting, pulling triggers as fast as they could work the bolts on their rifles. Horst was crying as he fired, tears streaming down his dirt-covered face. Rudy's hands shook so badly he could barely load his weapon. The Americans returned fire with disciplined precision, their bullets cracking past the boys' positions and thudding into the dirt embankments. Lieutenant Kessler was hit in the first exchange, falling backward into the trench with a surprised expression on his face. He died within minutes, leaving the boys leaderless and terrified. The battle lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Americans advanced methodically, using smoke grenades and suppressing fire to move from position to position. They were professionals fighting against children, and the outcome was never in doubt. When American soldiers appeared directly in front of their position, Bernie tried to bayonet one of them. Sergeant Milton Kowalczyk caught the blade with his bare hand, blood running down his palm, and twisted the rifle away with surprising gentleness. The look on his face wasn't anger or hatred, it was sadness. One by one, the boys were disarmed and pulled from their positions. They were searched for weapons and for papers, then herded together in the village square. Erwin looked around at his friends, all of them covered in dirt and cordite, their faces pale with shock and fear. This was the moment they had been warned about. This was when the torture and execution would begin, just as they had been told. Instead, an American medic began treating Bernie's bruised ribs where he had been tackled during his capture. Another soldier offered Rudy a canteen of water. The American soldiers moved with efficient purpose through the captured village, securing buildings and establishing a temporary command post in what remained of the town hall. The 6 boys were kept together under guard in the square, sitting on the ground with their hands visible as they had been instructed through gestures and broken German. Sergeant Kowalczyk had wrapped his bleeding hand in a field dressing and now stood nearby, watching the prisoners with an expression the boys couldn't quite read. It wasn't the cruel satisfaction they had expected. It looked almost like concern. Captain Lawrence Whitfield arrived 30 minutes after the fighting ended, his jeep pulling up beside the makeshift prisoner collection point. He was a tall man with graying temples and a weathered face that suggested he had been fighting since North Africa. He spoke briefly with Sergeant Kowalczyk, glancing over at the 6 boys several times during their conversation. Erwin watched this exchange with growing dread, certain they were discussing methods of execution. Bernie sat rigid beside him, determined to face death with dignity. Rudy had stopped crying, but his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. Private First Class George Papadopoulos, a stocky Greek-American from Philadelphia, was assigned guard duty over the boys. He settled onto a pile of rubble nearby, his rifle across his lap, and pulled out a battered photograph from his pocket. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at the boys, then back at the photograph. He shook his head slowly and said something in English that sounded sad. Lothar, who had studied some English in school before the war, caught a few words: children, young, home. The American soldier's eyes were gentle rather than hard. Corporal Frank Tesaro joined Papadopoulos, carrying a field radio and speaking rapid Italian-accented English. He, too, looked at the boys with an expression that confused them. Where was the hatred they had been promised? Where was the cruelty? These Americans treated them more like lost children than dangerous enemies. Tesaro offered Waldy a cigarette, which the boy declined with a shake of his head. The American smiled slightly and put the cigarettes away, then offered a chocolate bar instead. Waldy stared at it, as if it might be poisoned. As evening approached, the boys remained in the square, still waiting for their fate to be decided. They watched American soldiers setting up tents, preparing meals, and going about the routine business of occupation. No one had struck them. No one had threatened them. They were given water when they asked for it through gestures. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught to expect and what they were experiencing left them confused and off balance, unsure whether this kindness was genuine or simply a prelude to something worse. As dusk settled over the ruined village, the temperature dropped, and the boys began to shiver in their thin uniforms. They had not eaten since the morning before the battle, their meager rations lost or abandoned during the fighting. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but they were too frightened to ask for food from their captors. They sat in silence, watching American soldiers move about with the casual efficiency of men who had done this countless times before. Cooking fires were lit, and the smell of food drifted across the square, making Rudy's stomach growl audibly in the quiet evening air. Sergeant Kowalczyk disappeared into one of the temporary structures the Americans had established, and the boys tensed, certain he had gone to receive orders for their execution. They had been waiting all day for this moment, and now it seemed to have arrived. Bernie straightened his back, determined to face whatever came with the courage expected of a German soldier. Horst clutched his sketchbook tighter, as if this small piece of normality might protect him. Erwin closed his eyes and thought of his mother, hoping she would somehow know he had died bravely. But when Sergeant Kowalczyk emerged 10 minutes later, he wasn't carrying weapons or restraints. He was carrying a large metal plate covered with a cloth napkin. Behind him came Private Papadopoulos with 6 tin cups and a canteen of what looked like milk, Corporal Tesaro, followed with another plate. The 3 Americans approached the boys slowly, as if trying not to startle frightened animals. Kowalczyk knelt down in front of them and carefully removed the cloth napkin, revealing what lay beneath. 6 generous slices of apple pie, still warm, the crust golden brown, and the filling glistening with cinnamon-sweet juice. The boys stared at the pie as if it were some kind of hallucination. In their entire lives, even before the war, none of them had seen such abundance. Sugar had been rationed in Germany since 1939, Fresh fruit had become nearly impossible to find. And here, in the hands of their enemies, was more food wealth than most German civilians saw in a month. Erwin's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This had to be a trick, some kind of cruel joke before they were killed. But the Americans were smiling, genuine smiles that reached their eyes. Sergeant Kowalczyk pointed to the pie, then to the boys, then made an eating gesture with his hand. When no one moved, he picked up one slice himself, took a bite, and made an exaggerated expression of satisfaction. He was showing them it wasn't poisoned, that it was safe to eat. Papadopoulos poured milk into the tin cups and set them down within reach. Tesoro unwrapped the second plate to reveal thick slices of white bread with butter, another impossible luxury. The three American soldiers stepped back slightly, giving the boys space, waiting to see if they would accept this unprecedented offering of kindness from men they had been taught to see as monsters. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 6 boys sat frozen, staring at the food before them, while their captors waited patiently. Years of propaganda had taught them that Americans were savage, that they tortured prisoners, that mercy was a weakness the enemy did not possess. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything they believed. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful, like trying to hold two opposite truths in their minds simultaneously. Erwin felt something breaking inside him, some wall he had built around his understanding of the world beginning to crack and crumble. Rudy was the first to break. 12 years old, hungry, exhausted, and overwhelmed by the day's terror, he reached out with a trembling hand and picked up one of the tin cups. He brought it to his lips and drank, the cold milk leaving a white mustache on his upper lip. His eyes widened at the taste, at the richness of real milk, undiluted and fresh. He looked up at Sergeant Kowalczyk with an expression of pure confusion, as if asking why someone would give this to an enemy. The American sergeant just nodded encouragingly and gestured toward the pie. That simple act opened the floodgates. Waldy reached for a slice of pie, his hand shaking so badly that Corporal Tesoro steadied the plate for him. Lothar took the bread, breaking off a piece and chewing slowly, savoring the softness of wheat bread instead of the sawdust-mixed rations they had been eating for months. Horst cradled his slice of pie like something precious, looking at it for several seconds before taking his first bite. When the sweet apple and cinnamon hit his tongue, tears began streaming down his face again, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of relief, of confusion, of something he couldn't quite name. Even Bernie, still defiant and suspicious, eventually reached for the food. He took a slice of pie and ate it quickly, mechanically, refusing to show how much it affected him. But Erwin noticed his friend's hand trembling as he ate, saw the way Bernie's jaw clenched as if fighting against some internal battle. The propaganda had told them Americans were demons. But demons didn't share their food with captured enemies. Demons didn't smile gently at frightened children. Demons didn't treat prisoners with dignity and care. As the boys ate, the 3 American soldiers sat down nearby, maintaining a respectful distance, but staying close enough to offer more if needed. They talked quietly among themselves in English, occasionally glancing at the boys with expressions of sympathy. Papadopoulos pulled out that photograph again, showing it to Kowalczyk and Tesoro. From where he sat, Erwin could just make out the image of 3 young boys, probably around their same ages, standing in front of a house somewhere in America. Papadopoulos was pointing at the photograph, then at the German prisoners, his meaning clear even without translation. These could be his brothers. These could be anyone's children. The apple pie was unlike anything the boys had ever tasted, and not just because of their hunger. It represented something far more profound than simple nourishment. Each bite carried the weight of American abundance, of a country that could afford to give sugar and butter and fresh apples to enemy prisoners while their own nation was starving. Erwin chewed slowly, trying to make sense of this impossible generosity. In Germany, children were eating potato peels and turnip soup. Here, American soldiers casually distributed desserts to boys who had been shooting at them just hours earlier. The disparity was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Horst finished his slice and carefully wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then did something that surprised everyone. He opened his sketchbook to a blank page and began drawing. His hands moved quickly, capturing the scene before him with practiced strokes. The ruins of the village square, the American soldiers sitting nearby, the empty plate that had held their unexpected meal. He was documenting this moment because some part of him understood it was significant, that this was something worth remembering. Sergeant Kowalczyk noticed what he was doing and moved closer, watching over Horst's shoulder with interest. When the sketch was finished, the American nodded with approval and gave Horst a thumbs-up gesture. Waldy had stopped praying, his whispered words to God falling silent as he processed what had happened. His father had taught him that evil revealed itself through actions, that you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who had no power to resist them. By that measure, these Americans were not the monsters he had been warned about. They were something else entirely, something that didn't fit into the simple categories of friend and enemy, good and evil that the war had taught him to use. He looked at Corporal Tesaro, who was now showing Rudy a photograph of his own family back in New Jersey, and Waldy felt his certainty about the war beginning to dissolve. Lothar, ever observant, was noticing details that the others missed. The way Sergeant Kowalczyk kept flexing his injured hand, the one Bernie had cut with the bayonet, but showed no anger toward the boy who had wounded him. The way Private Papadopoulos kept checking to make sure all 6 boys had enough to eat before sitting down with his own meal. The way Captain Whitfield walked past their group and paused to say something to his men, his tone suggesting instructions about the prisoners' care rather than their punishment. These small observations accumulated into a picture that contradicted everything Lothar had been taught about the enemy. As darkness fell completely, American soldiers brought blankets for the boys, thick wool blankets that smelled clean and felt warm. They were shown to a partially intact building where they would spend the night, still under guard but treated more like refugees than prisoners of war. Before they settled in, Sergeant Kowalczyk returned one more time with canteens of water and several chocolate bars, distributing them with the same gentle efficiency he had shown with the pie. Sleep came fitfully that first night in American custody. The boys lay on the floor of the damaged building, wrapped in their borrowed blankets, listening to the sounds of the occupation outside. American voices talked and laughed in the darkness, radio static crackled from the command post, and somewhere a soldier played a harmonica, the melody unfamiliar but oddly comforting. Erwin stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the guard's lantern dance across cracked plaster, and tried to reconcile what he had experienced with what he had been taught to believe about the enemy. The propaganda had been so specific, so detailed in its warnings about American cruelty. They had been shown drawings of American soldiers torturing prisoners, told stories of captured Germans being starved and beaten, warned that surrender meant certain death. Every Hitler Youth meeting had reinforced these messages, building a wall of fear around the very idea of capture. Yet here they were, alive and unharmed, their stomachs full of apple pie and chocolate. The disconnect was so profound that Erwin wondered if perhaps this was an elaborate deception, a way of lowering their guard before the real torture began. But even as he thought this, he knew it didn't make sense. Why waste food on prisoners you plan to kill? Beside him, Bernie lay rigid with his own internal struggle. He had been the most fervent believer among them, the one whose hatred of the Allies burned brightest after his family home was destroyed in a bombing raid. He had joined the defense forces voluntarily, eager to make the enemy pay for what they had done to Germany. He had expected to die fighting, and when that proved impossible, he had expected to die as a prisoner. Instead, he had been given pie. The simplicity of that act was somehow more devastating than any torture could have been. It stripped away his righteous anger and left him feeling hollow and confused, unsure of who he was supposed to hate anymore. Rudy had cried himself to exhaustion and now slept deeply, making small, whimpering sounds like a much younger child. In sleep, the soldier's mask fell away completely, revealing the 12-year-old boy beneath. Waldy lay with his hands folded in prayer position, his lips moving silently as he worked through theological questions that had no easy answers. If these Americans were evil, why did they show mercy? If they were good, what did that make Germany? What did that make the boys themselves, who had fought for the Reich? His father's teachings about morality and righteousness suddenly seemed inadequate for the complexity of what he was experiencing. Horst couldn't sleep at all. He lay with his sketchbook open, using the faint light from outside to add details to his earlier drawing. He was trying to capture not just what he had seen, but what he had felt in that moment when Sergeant Kowalczyk had offered them food. The kindness in the American's eyes, the gentleness of his gesture, the way he had treated them as if they mattered, as if they were worth caring about, even though they were enemies. Horst's pencil moved across the page, searching for a way to make visible the invisible thing that had happened in the village square that evening. Morning arrived with unexpected normalcy. The boys were awakened not by rough shouts or kicks, but by the smell of cooking food drifting through the broken window of their shelter. Private Papadopoulos appeared at the doorway with a cheerful greeting in English and gestured for them to follow him to where breakfast was being served. The American field kitchen had been set up in the square, and soldiers were lining up with their mess kits for eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. The abundance was shocking to boys who had been eating increasingly meager rations for months. The 6 German prisoners were given their own plates, piled high with more food than they typically saw in several days. Real eggs, not the powdered substitute they had grown accustomed to. Thick slices of bacon, crispy and rich with fat. White bread toasted golden brown and spread with butter and jam. Erwin stared at his plate, calculating in his head how many ration cards this meal would require in Germany, then realizing it would be impossible to obtain regardless of cards. This was food that simply didn't exist anymore in the Reich. The Americans had so much they could feed it to prisoners without hesitation. As they ate, Captain Whitfield approached their group with Sergeant Kowalczyk serving as translator. The captain had found a German-English dictionary somewhere and was attempting basic communication. He pointed to each boy in turn, asking their names and ages. When he learned that Rudy was only 12, his weathered face showed visible distress. He spoke rapidly to Kowalczyk, who nodded in agreement. Through broken German and gestures, they conveyed that the boys would be transported to a proper prisoner of war facility, not left in the temporary camp. They would be kept together, not separated. They would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Lothar, whose English was the best among them, managed to ask a halting question that had been troubling all of them. "Why you give us food? Why you not?" He struggled for the word, finally settling on a gesture that suggested violence. Captain Whitfield looked at him with an expression of genuine sadness. He spoke slowly in English, letting Lothar work through the translation. "You're children. You shouldn't be soldiers at all. We don't make war on children." The words were simple, but their impact was profound. In that moment, something shifted in how the boys saw themselves. For months, they had been told they were soldiers, defenders of the fatherland, warriors in a great cause. They had tried desperately to live up to that identity, to be brave and hard and willing to die for Germany. But Captain Whitfield had looked at them and seen something else entirely. He had seen children playing at war, boys who had been robbed of their youth by a regime desperate enough to arm 12-year-olds and send them to fight. His refusal to treat them as real soldiers was somehow more powerful than his kindness with the food. It gave them permission to stop pretending to be something they were not, to acknowledge the fear and confusion they had been hiding behind military bearing. Over the next 3 days, as the American unit secured the area and prepared to move forward, the 6 boys remained in their custody. The initial shock of kind treatment gradually gave way to something more complex, a tentative trust mixed with lingering suspicion and confusion. They were allowed to move freely within the guarded perimeter, no longer kept under close watch every moment. This freedom itself was disorienting. They had expected chains and confinement, not the ability to walk around the ruined village and observe the American occupation up close. Corporal Tesoro had taken a particular interest in teaching the boys basic English phrases. He would point to objects and name them, then have the boys repeat the words back to him. Cup, plate, bread. Thank you. The lessons became informal games, with Tesoro exaggerating his pronunciation to make the boys laugh when they attempted to copy his thick New Jersey accent. Laughter had seemed impossible just days ago, but here it was, rising up spontaneously when Bernie mispronounced water as Vader and Tesoro pretended not to understand, pointing to his father and making confused gestures until everyone was giggling despite themselves. Private Papadopoulos had brought out a worn leather baseball and was trying to teach the boys how to throw and catch American style. The game made no sense to them at first, accustomed as they were to football, but Papadopoulos was patient and enthusiastic. He showed them how to grip the ball, how to step forward as they threw, how to position their hands to catch. Rudy, the youngest, proved surprisingly good at it, his small hands quick and sure. When he made a particularly good catch, Papadopoulos whooped with delight and ruffled his hair, a gesture so natural and paternal that Rudy's eyes filled with sudden tears. He missed his father desperately, and this American stranger's approval touched something deep inside him. Horst had been given paper and pencils by one of the American soldiers who had noticed his artistic talent. He spent hours sketching the scenes around him, documenting the strange, peaceful interlude in the midst of war. He drew Sergeant Kowalczyk teaching Waldy how to play cards, the two of them sitting on ammunition crates with complete concentration. He drew Lothar helping American mechanics work on a damaged truck, his mechanical aptitude evident despite the language barrier. He drew Bernie, still somewhat apart from the group, watching everything with wary eyes, but no longer radiating the fierce hatred that had defined him days earlier. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. They were becoming children again, shedding the brittle armor of soldiers they had tried so hard to wear. They laughed at Tesoro's jokes even when they didn't fully understand them. They competed to see who could learn the most English words each day. They ate the astonishing abundance of American rations without guilt or suspicion, and slowly, carefully, they began to trust that perhaps not everything they had been taught about the enemy was true. On the fourth day of their captivity, Captain Whitfield brought the boys paper and pencils, offering them the opportunity to write letters home. The gesture was made through Sergeant Kowalczyk's broken German and hand gestures, but the meaning was clear. The boys could let their families know they were alive and safe. For several minutes, none of them moved. The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they had been taught about prisoner treatment, that they couldn't immediately process it. Enemy soldiers weren't supposed to care if German families worried about their captured sons. Erwin was the first to accept the paper. He sat in a quiet corner of the ruined building that had become their temporary home and stared at the blank page for a long time before beginning to write. How could he explain to his parents what had happened? How could he describe the Americans in a way that wouldn't sound like propaganda or collaboration? He started several times, crossing out words and beginning again. Finally, he wrote simply about being captured, about being treated well, about having enough to eat. He didn't mention the apple pie or the baseball games, or the way Sergeant Kowalczyk had smiled when teaching them English words. Those details felt too strange, too impossible to explain in a letter that might be read by officials. Horst wrote to his mother with tears streaming down his face, his handwriting shaky with emotion. He told her he was alive and unharmed, that she shouldn't worry, that he hoped to see her soon. What he didn't write was that he was starting to question everything they had been taught about the war, about Germany's enemies, about the righteousness of their cause. Those doubts felt like betrayal, like evidence of weakness that would shame his family if spoken aloud. So he kept his letter simple and safe, filled with reassurances rather than truth. Bernie stared at his blank paper for over an hour. He had no home to write to, no family waiting to hear from him. His parents and younger sister had died in the bombing raid that had fueled his hatred of the Allies. He had joined the defense forces with nothing to lose, ready to die taking revenge for their deaths. Now he sat holding a pencil, offered by the same Americans whose bombs had killed his family, and he didn't know what to feel anymore. Eventually, he wrote a short letter to his uncle in Munich. If the uncle still lived, if Munich still existed, he wrote about being captured and treated fairly. He didn't write about the confusion tearing him apart inside. Rudy wrote to his mother, his words those of a frightened child rather than a soldier. He told her he missed her, that he wanted to come home, that the Americans were being kind to him. He asked if she had heard anything about his father, who had been on the Eastern Front when Rudy was captured. He promised he would be brave and make her proud. His letter was stained with tears by the time he finished, the ink running in places where drops had fallen. On April 28th, orders came for the boys to be transported to a larger prisoner of war facility near Frankfurt. The news filled them with mixed emotions they couldn't fully articulate. They had grown accustomed to their small group of American captors, had developed a tentative comfort with Sergeant Kowalczyk's patient guidance and Private Papadopoulos's cheerful encouragement. The idea of being transferred to a large camp filled with thousands of prisoners felt somehow more frightening than their current situation, despite the fact that they would be among fellow Germans rather than enemies. The morning of their departure, the 3 American soldiers who had become their primary caretakers gathered the boys together for what felt like a farewell. Sergeant Kowalczyk, through his broken German, tried to explain what they should expect at the camp. He emphasized that the Geneva Convention required humane treatment, that they would receive adequate food and shelter, that they would be allowed to write letters and receive packages. But his words couldn't entirely mask his own concern. He knew that large camps were different from small units, that bureaucracy could be cold even when rules demanded humanity. Corporal Tesoro gave each boy a chocolate bar from his personal rations, pressing them into their hands with firm encouragement. Private Papadopoulos pulled Rudy aside and gave him the baseball they had been playing with, along with an exaggerated demonstration of proper throwing technique that made the boy smile despite his nervousness. Captain Whitfield, speaking through Lothar's translation, told them that they had shown courage and dignity during their captivity. He hoped they would remember that not all enemies had to remain enemies forever, that peace would come eventually, and they would need to build it together. The truck ride to the POW camp took 6 hours through devastated countryside. The boys saw evidence of Germany's defeat everywhere. Bombed-out cities reduced to hollow shells, bridges collapsed into rivers, refugees trudging along roads with everything they owned loaded onto carts and wagons. The Germany they had fought to defend no longer existed. In its place was this broken landscape of ash and rubble, a nation that had gambled everything on victory and lost. Erwin stared out at the ruins and felt something inside him break loose, some final attachment to the propaganda that had shaped his understanding of the war. When they arrived at the POW camp, the contrast with their previous experience was immediate and stark. The facility housed over 3,000 German prisoners, organized into barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Processing took hours, with bureaucratic forms and medical examinations and assignment to quarters. The American guards here were professional but distant, nothing like the personal attention they had received from Kowalczyk and his unit. This was industrial-scale prisoner management, efficient but impersonal. The boys were separated by age, with Rudy sent to a special section for underage prisoners, while the others were assigned to general population barracks. Life in the POW camp settled into routines that were simultaneously better and worse than what the boys had expected. The Geneva Convention was followed strictly, with adequate food, shelter, and medical care provided to all prisoners. Meals were served 3 times daily, and while they lacked the abundance of fresh eggs and bacon the boys had experienced during their first days of captivity, they were substantially more than German civilians were receiving. Red Cross packages arrived regularly, bringing additional food, cigarettes, and small luxuries. By the standards of war, the prisoners were treated remarkably well. Yet something essential was missing from this institutional care. The Americans who had first captured them had seen them as individuals, had responded to them as specific boys with specific needs and personalities. Here, They were prisoner numbers in a vast bureaucratic system. Guards rotated shifts and rarely learned prisoners' names. Interactions were formal and procedural rather than personal. The kindness of Sergeant Kowalczyk and his unit had been genuine human connection. The correctness of the camp administration was something else entirely, adequate but emotionally hollow. Erwin found himself assigned to work details in the camp kitchen, where he learned to prepare food for thousands of men. The work was hard but gave him purpose and kept his mind occupied. He discovered that many of the older prisoners were Wehrmacht veterans who had been captured months or years earlier on various fronts. Their stories painted a picture of the war's progression that propaganda had never shown: the grinding defeat in Russia, the hopeless defense of France, the systematic destruction of Germany's military capacity. These men had no illusions left about victory or righteousness. They spoke openly about their relief at being out of the fighting, their shame at what Germany had become, their uncertainty about what would happen when the war finally ended. Horst was given permission to continue his artwork, and his sketches began circulating through the camp. Other prisoners requested drawings of their families from memory, of their hometowns as they remembered them before the war, of scenes from peacetime that seemed impossibly distant now. Horst drew these memories for men who had nothing else left to hold on to, and in doing so, he found a way to process his own complicated feelings about everything that had happened. His art became a form of testimony, documenting both the horror of what Germany had done and the humanity that persisted despite it all. Bernie struggled more than the others. His anger had been the core of his identity, and without it, he felt lost and purposeless. He picked fights with other prisoners, challenged guards unnecessarily, and spent long hours staring at the barbed wire with an expression of deep internal conflict. Waldy tried to reach out to him, offering the spiritual comfort his father had taught him, but Bernie rejected these overtures harshly. He wasn't ready yet to accept forgiveness or to forgive himself for believing in causes that had led to such devastation. May 8, 1945, arrived with little fanfare in the POW camp. Word spread through the barracks that Germany had officially surrendered, that the war in Europe was over, that Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich had ceased to exist. The boys had been prisoners for just over 2 weeks, but those weeks had contained more transformation than the previous years of their lives combined. Now they faced the reality that the world they had known before capture was gone completely, replaced by something unknown and potentially terrifying. The camp's atmosphere shifted dramatically after the surrender announcement. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, relieved that the killing had finally stopped. Others fell into deep depression, mourning the loss of everything they had believed in and fought for. Many simply felt numb, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. Germany had lost the war. The fatherland had been defeated utterly. Everything they had sacrificed, every privation they had endured, every friend and family member who had died, had been for nothing. The ideals they had been taught to revere were revealed as lies and poison. For the 6 boys, the surrender brought a different kind of crisis. They were still children, barely into their teenage years, but they had seen and done things that no child should experience. They had fought in battle, been captured by enemies who turned out to be more humane than their own leaders, and now faced returning to a Germany that existed only as an occupied territory under foreign control. Their families, if they still lived, would be scattered among the ruins. Their homes might be destroyed. The future was a blank page with no clear writing on it. Rudy, kept in the youth section of the camp, received word that his mother had been located through Red Cross channels. She was alive, living in a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, searching desperately for news of both her sons. Rudy was told that his father had died in the last weeks of the war, killed during the Soviet advance into Germany. The news broke something in the 12-year-old that had remained intact through everything else. He wept for days, inconsolable despite the efforts of American chaplains and older prisoners to comfort him. His childhood was over in ways that even the fighting hadn't accomplished. The American camp administration began preparing for mass repatriation of prisoners. With the war over, German POWs would be returned to their homeland, though the process would take months given the sheer numbers involved and the logistical challenges of moving people through a devastated landscape. The boys learned they would likely be among the first groups repatriated because of their young age. They should have felt relief at this news, excitement at the prospect of going home. Instead, they felt profound uncertainty about what home even meant anymore. The repatriation began in early June of 1945. The boys were processed through multiple checkpoints, given travel documents, and loaded onto trucks that would take them through occupied Germany to their respective home regions. The journey revealed the full extent of their nation's devastation in ways that even their earlier glimpses hadn't prepared them for. Every major city they passed was a landscape of rubble. Frankfurt, Mannheim, Heidelberg, all reduced to hollow shells with populations living in cellars and makeshift shelters. The proud Germany they had been taught to defend existed only in memory now. Erwin was the first to be dropped off, his village lying closest to the repatriation route. As the truck pulled into what remained of his hometown, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The carpentry shop where his father had taught him to work with wood was gone, destroyed in the final weeks of fighting. Their house stood damaged but partially intact, windows blown out and one wall collapsed, but still recognizable as home. His mother emerged from the damaged building at the sound of the truck, and when she saw her son, she ran toward him with a cry that contained months of grief and fear and desperate hope. Their reunion was tearful and complicated. Erwin's father had survived the war but was being held in a French POW camp. His younger sister had been evacuated to relatives in the countryside and hadn't yet returned. His mother was thin, worn down by hunger and worry, but alive. She held Erwin as if he might disappear if she loosened her grip, and he let her, feeling simultaneously like the child he had been and the person he had become through his experiences. When she finally released him, she looked into his eyes and saw something changed there, some loss of innocence that could never be restored. Horst's homecoming 2 days later was darker. The truck dropped him in a town that no longer existed as anything but ruins. He searched for hours before finding his mother living in a partially collapsed apartment building with 6 other families. His father had died in the defense of Berlin. His older brother's fate remained unknown, lost somewhere on the Eastern Front. His mother's grief at seeing him alive was overwhelming, but it was grief mixed with such profound loss that Horst barely recognized her. The vibrant woman who had encouraged his artistic dreams had been replaced by this exhausted stranger who looked decades older than her actual age. Bernie discovered that his uncle had survived and was attempting to rebuild the family smithy in Munich, though Munich itself was so devastated that reconstruction seemed impossible. The reunion was awkward, neither quite knowing what to say to the other. Bernie's uncle had lost his own son in the war and looked at his nephew with a mixture of relief and complicated resentment, as if wondering why Bernie had survived when his cousin hadn't. The unspoken questions hung between them, making the damaged smithy feel even colder than the ruined buildings around it. Waldy returned to find his father's church destroyed. The congregation scattered. His father had survived, but was broken in spirit, struggling to reconcile his faith with the horrors that had been committed in Germany's name. Lothar's mother was alive, but their farm was occupied by French soldiers, their status uncertain. The months following repatriation were among the hardest the boys had experienced, harder in many ways than the war itself. They returned to a Germany that was not just defeated, but morally devastated, a nation forced to confront the full extent of atrocities committed in its name. As Allied forces opened concentration camps and documented the systematic murder of millions, every German faced an impossible question about what they had known, what they had suspected, what they had chosen not to see. The boys, young as they were, couldn't escape this reckoning. Erwin worked alongside his mother to repair their damaged house, scavenging materials from more thoroughly destroyed buildings. The physical labor was welcome, a distraction from the constant mental turmoil. But he couldn't stop thinking about his brief time as an American prisoner, about the inexplicable kindness he had received from men who had every reason to hate him. That kindness haunted him, challenged him, demanded something from him that he was still learning to understand. When he encountered other returning soldiers, bitter and angry about Germany's defeat, he found himself defending the Americans, describing how they had treated child prisoners with dignity and care. His words were often met with suspicion or dismissal. Some accused him of being brainwashed by enemy propaganda, of collaborating with occupiers, of forgetting his German identity. But Erwin persisted because he knew what he had experienced was real and important. Sergeant Kowalczyk had shown him that enemies could choose to see each other's humanity, that mercy was possible even in war's darkest moments. If Germany was to be rebuilt, if the German people were to find any path toward redemption, it would require embracing those same principles rather than clinging to the hatred that had brought such destruction. Horst channeled his experiences into his artwork with renewed purpose. He created a series of drawings documenting both the war's devastation and the small moments of humanity he had witnessed during his captivity. The American soldier sharing chocolate with a frightened 12-year-old, the captain who looked at child soldiers and refused to treat them as enemies, the unexpected gift of apple pie in the midst of ruin. These images became his way of testifying that even in humanity's worst moments, individual people could still choose kindness over cruelty, compassion over revenge. Bernie's journey was slower and more painful. He worked in his uncle's smithy, learning to shape metal while trying to reshape his understanding of everything he had believed. The anger that had defined him for so long had burned out, leaving him feeling empty and directionless. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. He started helping neighbors rebuild without being asked, sharing food when he had any extra, showing patience with the younger children in the neighborhood who reminded him of Rudy. He never spoke about his time as a prisoner or the Americans who had captured him, but those experiences had planted seeds that were slowly, quietly beginning to grow. October 12, 1995. Erwin Mühlberg stood in the lobby of a hotel in Frankfurt, now 70 years old, waiting for a reunion he had anticipated for months, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. After 50 years, he would finally see again the men who had captured him in the ruins of Rothenberg, who had fed him apple pie when he expected execution, who had shown him that enemies could become something else entirely. The meeting had been arranged through military historians researching unusual prisoner-of-war stories, bringing together the aging German boys and their American captors for one final encounter. Sergeant Milton Kowalczyk arrived first, now 85 years old, his once strong frame bent with age, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and kindness. When he saw Erwin, recognition flickered across his weathered face, despite the decades that had passed. They approached each other slowly, two old men who had once been on opposite sides of a war, and embraced with surprising emotion. Kowalczyk's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but Erwin could still see the scar from where Bernie's bayonet had cut him 50 years earlier. That small mark had carried across half a century, a permanent reminder of the moment when everything had changed. Private Papadopoulos came next, retired from a successful restaurant business in Philadelphia. He had brought photographs, including that picture he had shown to the boys during the war of his own brothers who were now grandfathers themselves. Corporal Tesaro arrived in a wheelchair, his legs weakened by age but his spirit still vibrant with energy. Captain Whitfield had died 3 years earlier, but his daughter attended in his place, carrying letters her father had written about the 6 German child soldiers he had refused to treat as enemies. One by one, the German boys arrived, now men in their 60s with grown children and grandchildren of their own. Horst had become an art teacher, his sketches from the war now housed in museums documenting the period. Waldy had followed his father into ministry, spending decades working on reconciliation between Germans and Jews. Lothar had become an engineer, helping rebuild the country he had once tried to defend. Bernie arrived last, hesitant and uncertain, but when Sergeant Kowalczyk embraced him and said in careful German that he bore no grudge for the wound, Bernie wept openly for the first time in 50 years. Only Rudy was missing. He had died young, killed in a construction accident while helping rebuild Munich in 1952. His mother attended in his place, now 93 years old, carrying the baseball that Private Papadopoulos had given her son. She returned it to the American with trembling hands, saying through a translator that it had been Rudy's most treasured possession until the day he died, a reminder that kindness was possible even in the darkest times. Papadopoulos accepted the baseball with tears streaming down his face. The reunion lasted 3 days, filled with conversations that ranged from laughter to tears, from reminiscence to reflection on everything that had changed in the 50 years since the war ended. The men sat together in the hotel conference room, now equals rather than captors and captives, sharing stories about what had happened to them after that brief intersection of their lives in April of 1945. They spoke different languages but understood each other perfectly, because they shared something deeper than words, a common memory of choosing humanity over hatred when that choice had mattered most. Erwin gave a speech on the final day, translated line by line so both German and American attendees could understand. He spoke about returning to Rothenberg as an adult, finding the village square where they had been given apple pie, standing in that space and remembering the confused 15-year-old boy he had been. He spoke about building a life in post-war Germany, about the choices he had made to honor the mercy he had received by showing mercy to others. He spoke about teaching his children and grandchildren that enemies were made, not born, and could therefore be unmade through conscious decisions to see each other's humanity. Sergeant Kowalczyk responded with his own reflections, his voice thick with emotion as he described what it had been like to look at 6 terrified German boys and see his own nephews staring back at him. He spoke about the decision he and his fellow soldiers had made to treat those boys not as enemies, but as children who had been failed by the adults who should have protected them. He spoke about wondering for 50 years whether that small act of kindness had mattered, whether it had made any difference in the larger scope of history. Now, seeing these men who had built good lives and raised families and worked toward reconciliation, he knew that it had. The historians documenting the reunion asked what lessons should be drawn from this unusual story. What did it mean that 6 German child soldiers had been shown mercy by their American captors? What did it teach about the nature of war, of enmity, of the possibilities for human transformation? The answers came not from any single voice, but from the collective testimony of everyone present. It meant that in even the worst circumstances, individuals retained the power to choose kindness over cruelty. It taught that seeing the humanity in enemies required conscious effort, but offered rewards that extended across generations. It showed that the most powerful victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people decided what kind of human beings they wanted to be. As the reunion concluded, the group gathered for a final photograph. Germans and Americans, former enemies now bound by friendship and shared memory, standing together with arms around each other's shoulders. Horst, still sketching after all these years, captured the moment with quick, sure strokes. The image would later be published alongside the story of the German child soldiers who expected execution but received apple pie instead, becoming a symbol of reconciliation's possibilities. In the photograph, you could see clearly what the war had tried to destroy but failed to eliminate: the capacity of human beings to recognize each other across all divisions, to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier, to transform enemies into guardians of each other's dignity and humanity across half a century and beyond.